What's going on, everybody? Welcome to my channel. My name is Slamurai. For those of you who have followed me on other forms of social for a while now, you know that I have always talked about some rather dark topics, and it wasn't until just recently I started talking about some lighter subjects on this platform. That being said, I just wanted to take some time and reassure all of those people who did follow me for those subjects that I have not forgotten about you. So without further ado, we're going to go ahead and get right into 10 of the most terrifying ways people have met their maker. Plus, an additional story that I didn't really feel like made this list, but it is somewhat related. It just has a lot more mystery added to it. Without wasting any more of your time, let's begin. Well, what was thought to be a leak within this pillar ended up being much more horrifying than anyone could have imagined. You see, customers as well as employees of a grocery store located in Lancaster, California began complaining about a pungent odor near the front of the store. And as the days go by, the manager notices there is now a leak inside of one of the pillars directly at the front entrance. So he calls up his plumber in order to take a look. Well, upon his arrival, he sort of sits there staring at it for a second and goes, well, look, I'm gonna go ahead and take off a couple of these bricks. So after a short conversation, they both agree, and as he pulls back that first brick, this overly pungent odor becomes much more evident as they notice there is a person crammed inside this thing. This man's name was Reymundo Rivera, and just 5 days earlier he led police on a high-speed chase directly towards that store, crashing his truck into the side of it. Rivera then exited his vehicle and ran upstairs onto the roof, where he then entered an unlocked maintenance door. Inside this little room, there are two small holes either side, which lead all the way down to the bottom of these decorative pillars. Well, one of two things ended up happening. Rivera either jumped into one of these on his own accord, trying to hide from the police, or he accidentally fell inside while hiding in that room. Regardless, the material inside these pillars becomes thicker and thicker the more they go down, meaning every inch he slipped, more and more pressure would be applied to his chest until he just simply couldn't breathe anymore. Official cause of death: asphyxiation due to chest compression. In addition to this, over the course of the next 5 days, temperatures in the surrounding area had been well over 100 degrees, meaning even if he had survived a couple of days, he would have essentially been baked to death inside of that pillar, placing the pillar incident in the foundation of a series we're calling Terrifying Ways to Go, Episode 2. Back in 2012, a maintenance tech is performing a few repairs on one of these giant industrial ovens, and with the way their systems had been working, employees would load up thousands upon thousands of pounds of tuna into the carts shown on screen here. After topping them off, a button is pushed, activating a pulley system which will then draw the carts inside. The door will then close automatically, and the process of baking can begin. Well, as he's working as far away from the entrance as he can, unbeknownst to him, employees have just gotten done loading up about 13,000 pounds of tuna, when all of a sudden, that button is pushed. It is very likely that at this point, the man would have known there was little to nothing he could have done. With no room to slide past, climb over, or crawl underneath him, the weight of those carts slowly working him further and further away from survival, and closer towards a most certain death, till eventually the door closes and the heat begins to rise. This man's name was Jose Melina, and for the next 3 hours he had been baked at 175 degrees, ending his life in the process. It wasn't until the carts had been pulled out that he was discovered pinned up at the front of this oven. Bumblebee Foods was cited with a laundry list of violations, including failure to implement lockout-tagout procedures, meaning while Jose was in that oven, the machine should have been completely incapable of being turned on. In addition to this, the company received nearly $750,000 in fines. They were made to pay a total of $6 million to the family of Jose, thus making the Bumblebee Oven incident one of the most terrifying ways to go, Episode 3. Just out of sight. Back in November of 2009, a 25-year-old man out of Iowa had just gotten into an argument with his parents. It eventually gets to the point where he straight up leaves in the middle of a snowstorm, wearing no shoes, no socks, didn't even bother grabbing his keys or his wallet, and would never be seen again. That is, until 10 years later. A contracting company out of Council Bluffs, Iowa, is performing some renovations to a now vacant supermarket, and as they're pulling out these giant 12-foot tall coolers, they discover something something absolutely horrifying. A man who had long since been deceased had become completely pinned behind one of these coolers in an area less than 18 inches wide. That young man's name was Larry Murillo Moncada, and it is theorized that on the very day he got into that argument, he ran up in the store, climbed on top of the coolers, and ended up falling straight down into this little space. Now, while he did in fact work at this supermarket, it is said he was not scheduled to be working on the day he went missing, and while his death was deemed to be accidental, they were never able to determine an official cause. However, it is widely believed he had become so wedged between the cooler and the wall, he simply couldn't breathe anymore. In addition to this, the area on top of those coolers had become sort of an unofficial break spot for employees in the store, meaning that at several points in time, he was quite literally just out of sight, making the No Frills cooler incident one of the most terrifying ways to go. Episode 4, No Way Out. Jesse and Damien, two workers of a Kansas City power plant, have just been informed one of its 3 turbines has begun to lose power. It is believed this sudden loss in power could be due to a faulty purge valve. When functioning properly, this valve should only be open to allow scalding hot, overpressurized steam a route to escape the facility. So after a short conversation, Jesse and Damien grab a few tools and begin making their way towards the room that houses the valve. Now, in order to reach this location, they must take an elevator up a few floors where the doors will then open directly into that room. Little did they know the absolutely horrifying fate that awaited them on the other side. Unknown at the time, that valve had all but completely blown apart, thus allowing this extremely hot, superheated steam to completely fill the room. And we're not talking gradually. I mean, steam is quite literally blasting out of the line. What's worse is, the initial blowback of all of this pressure is currently spraying directly towards the door of that elevator. And when they finally open, the steam rolls in, exposing both men to temperatures of well over 600 degrees Celsius, or 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit, effectively sealing their fate in the process. In addition to this, it is very likely that as that elevator began to stop, they would have instantly known what was about to happen. As of mid-2021, the family of Jesse Henson was awarded $222 million in a wrongful death lawsuit, with the family of Damien Burchett following close behind. Friday, February 24th, 1989, a 26-year-old power plant worker had just finished having a conversation with his father. He then explained he had a few errands to run, grabbed his keys, drove off, and never returned. Now, initially, the entire community remained fairly optimistic that he would pop back up with some sort of rational explanation as to why he had been gone for so long. But just 3 days after his disappearance, this case would reach a devastating conclusion. Tuesday, February 28th, a woman discovers a shoe jammed about halfway down a pipe connecting her squatted toilet to her septic tank. She then walked outside through the roughly 8 inches of snow, removed the plate covering the tank, and discovers there is a man curled up in the fetal position, shoeless, shirtless, peering straight up through her toilet. This young man's name was Naoyuki Sugano, that very same person reported missing by his father just a few days earlier. Now, when the fire department shows up, it was apparent he had long since passed away. However, they had such a difficult time recovering him. They had to rip it up, cut into it, and essentially destroy the entire setup to do so. And if that's not weird, things are about to get taken to a whole new level. You see, the only way he could have gotten into that tank was through a pipe measuring roughly 14 inches wide. And as a pipe layer, I can tell you, very seldom do we ever have a guy that can crawl through 15-inch pipe, and we're talking straight runs, not heading into a 90-degree angle, getting yourself turned back around in order to get in the position this man was in. And many people out there, including the young man's father, have tried to recreate this situation using the measurements provided on screen here, but they simply couldn't do it. Next, he was found to be clutching his shirt, which had been neatly folded laying on his chest. And although, as stated before, one of his shoes was found jammed inside that pipe, the other one would later be found on the edge of a creek in the opposite direction of where he had parked his car, the keys to which were said to have been found still in the ignition. And believe me, look, I know I'm throwing a lot at you, but we're getting to the last few details, minus a few minor scratches on his body. There was no bruising or anything that indicated a struggle had taken place. The official cause of death, hypothermia, deemed to be accidental. Now this sparked outrage among many within the community, especially his family, as he was then labeled this creepy and disgusting peeping Tom. And a lot of people that knew Naoyuki just couldn't see him in this light. But I will say this, that woman he would have been peeping on had been gone the entire course of the weekend. And it's quite likely Naoyuki would have known this, as they had already been fairly well acquainted. And it's also worth pointing out, many out there firmly believe Naoyuki had been murdered, and that some sort of cover-up had taken place. A few of those theories involve other employees of the Fukushima power plant, the local government, or possibly even the woman who discovered his body. Terrifying Ways to Go, Episode 6. No turning back. So back in April of 2023, a father out of Lancaster, UK, along with his 3 children, had been very excited about a birthday party that was going to be taking place in Keswick, which is roughly an hour away. And it wasn't the fact that there was going to be cake and presents and all that sort of stuff, no. It was more so the facility this party was going to be taking place at. You see, there is an establishment known as Kong Adventure, and essentially this is a huge indoor climbing facility with a few extra features for adults and children alike to enjoy. And by all accounts, when they arrive, everyone is having an absolute blast. I mean, it was everything they thought it could be. However, there is yet another component to this place that gives it a little bit of a competitive edge, something that even indoor climbing facilities seldom have. That is a series of tunnels or man-made cave located within the panels of those rock walls. It's often been described as essentially a series of tight winding passages comprised of fiberglass that mimics the appearance of the interior of a cave. And so at one point, this man along with a group of children decide they're going to give it a go. But little did they know the unfortunate and ultimately horrifying tragedy that was about to unfold. While the children had no issues traversing these tunnels, they're proving to be a little more difficult for the dad. And as they continued making their way further and further from the entrance, one of 2 things would happen according to reports. But it's important to note, we will be sticking with the actual report documented by one of many rescue teams called in that day. At any rate, the man tried turning around in order to head back the way he came in. But as soon as he does, pure panic instantaneously sets in, as he has become completely wedged inside this thing. Now, unable to move, struggling to breathe, the man calls out for help. However, initial rescue efforts by the staff of this facility proved to be unsuccessful. There just simply wasn't enough room for anyone to gain enough leverage to be able to pull him out. It was at this time emergency services were notified, as customers and staff alike began removing wall panels in order to access this tunnel. And unfortunately, when the fire department arrived on scene, it was also very quickly discovered they too were not equipped for this situation. Unable to free him as well, 4 additional crews had to be called in, crews that specialize in complex mountain rescue operations. This man's name was Carl O'Keefe, and he would spend the next 4 hours completely stuck as more than 50 search and rescue personnel did anything and everything they could to free him, removing more panels, cutting through the wall in order to cut him out of this tunnel. But unfortunately, by the time they were able to do so, the damage had already been done. While Carl did initially survive, his condition would worsen over the course of the next week. He would tragically pass away 8 days later due to severe crushing-style injuries received from the incident. Now here's the thing. It's important to note when looking through sources about this incident, we understand the initial reporting of this incident was incorrect and has yet to be corrected even as of now. Reason being, not a single one of them actually took into account the words of those who were on scene at the time. The story we told you today comes from a statement made by Keswick Mountain Rescue personnel who were physically on scene during the incident. That being said, some of the main differences are as follows. Initial reports stated Carl had attempted to, I quote, turn a rock wall, at which point he ended up slipping and falling into a confined space within the wall itself. This was false and is still being taken as fact by many. Now the other story floating around is a little closer to accurate, stating that he had slipped inside the cave, becoming stuck in the process, with the remainder of the information about this case being mostly correct. And for those of you who are interested, a link to the actual report made by Keswick Mountain Rescue can be found in the description below. Now for most of us out there, myself included, I'm sure we can all remember a time where maybe we did something or said something we regret at some point. And I'm sure a few of us can remember a time maybe somebody we knew took things way too far and ended up making a horrible mistake. But just where's the defining line between mistake and murder? Well, this next case has always sort of been a focal point for that discussion. Let's continue. Terrifying Ways to Go, Episode 7. Just out of reach. Back in 2002, a guy out of Manhattan had just been out for a night of drinking with a couple of friends. Now as the night begins to wind down and they're making their way home, an argument breaks out between himself and another member of the group. Well, this argument would quickly escalate into a full-blown fight between the 2 men. And while there is much debate over what actually happened next, here is one of two leading scenarios ultimately leading to the same devastating conclusion. It is said that at some point, one of those two men, a man by the name of Keith Masters, overpowered the other man, lifting him up and throwing him 15 feet down into an open manhole. And although yes, a fall from this height alone is more than enough to take someone's life, this unfortunately was only the beginning of a much bigger problem. Little did they know that manhole had been housing a leaking hot water line that, just a few days earlier, had completely ruptured, effectively leaving the man waist deep in boiling water, while at the same time being completely engulfed in extremely hot steam. And to make matters even worse, although first responders and everyone on scene could hear his cries for help, the steam was so thick and so hot they were unable to physically get to him. It was at this point they began lowering various retrieval systems in hopes he was still able to follow their instructions, but unfortunately, the damage had already been done. By then, he was simply too weak and too injured to comply. This man's name was Kyle McGarity, often referred to as Sean Doyle, and he had spent the last 10 minutes of his life essentially being cooked at well over 300 degrees. Now it's worth pointing out, Keith Masters was originally charged with murder in the second degree, but to the dismay of Kyle's family, those charges were later dropped, leading to a very heated debate as to whether or not he was actually thrown or whether or not he fell. Either way, I think this goes without saying. That is among the most terrifying ways to go, episode 8, Hell or High Water. Back in August of 2021, Hurricane Ida had just made its way through Louisiana, leaving an absolute wake of destruction in its path. And like many, a 71-year-old man by the name of Timothy had elected to stay behind, thus riding out the storm alongside his wife. Now their biggest concern throughout the course of that storm had been the ever-rising water levels, and Tim had been periodically going out onto his front porch in order to see how close that water line was getting to their home. Well, by the evening of August 30th, the wind had begun to die down. The water levels had stopped rising, and the couple were finally given the opportunity to inspect the rest of their home for damage. With that, they grabbed their jackets, Tim grabs a flashlight, and they begin making their way towards the front door. But as soon as Tim steps outside, he is snatched by a 12-foot alligator that proceeds to drag him off into the night. Now, while his wife immediately contacted emergency services, she was told they would have to wait for the water levels to recede, as there was just simply no means of accessing that area at that point. With that, they take down a missing persons report, and within just a few days, they begin to receive more and more calls about this giant alligator that had just been roaming around the neighborhood. It was at this time a couple of men came out in order to hunt down that alligator, and when they finally caught it, they would unfortunately find the remains of Timothy inside that beast. Friends and frenemies alike, this has been Terrifying Ways to Go, Episode 9, Hisashi Ouchi, the most radiated man in history. On September 30th of 1999, Hisashi, along with a few co-workers, had began the process of mixing uranium into enriched uranium to later be used for nuclear purposes. But little did they know, the men had already far surpassed the amount needed of 5.4 pounds, with Hisashi standing over the tank adding in their 35th pound, more than 6 times what was actually needed. When all of a sudden, a bright blue flash rips through the entire room. And while everyone inside had been exposed to dangerous levels of radiation, Hisashi had been blasted with more than 2 times the lethal dose. Well, immediately, Hisashi can be heard screaming out in agony, as he was instantaneously suffering from immense radiation burns all over his entire body. And within just a couple of minutes, he is also suffering extreme bouts of nausea. Now, during the first few days of his treatment, it was quickly determined there wasn't really much they could do for him. I mean, his DNA had quite literally been obliterated, and his white blood cell count was virtually non-existent. It was at this point they sent him to another hospital located in Tokyo. And this is where the true horror began. You see, Hisashi had officially become the most radiated person in history. And rather than keeping him comfortable, they essentially take this opportunity to study its effects on the human body, all the while performing a series of highly invasive tests while keeping him alive for as long as they possibly could. Fairly quickly on, his skin begins to quite literally just fall off. And amid countless skin grafts and various other treatments, absolutely not a single one of them would take. Thus, they would have to end up wrapping his entire body in bandages, which would also have to be periodically changed, in a process that was said to be more painful than anyone could possibly imagine. Well, 59 days after this incident, Hisashi finally went into cardiac arrest. Not once, not twice, but but 3 times in a single hour. And against his own will, every single time, they resuscitated him, keeping him alive for another 24 days while continuing to perform these excruciating tests, which brings us to 83 days after the incident had occurred. Hisashi finally succumbed one final time. That being said, this incident, along with the experiments that followed, officially went down as one of the most terrifying ways to go, episode 10. Horrifying beyond belief. Back in June of 2017, a group of 6 individuals had just began the process of unclogging a slag tank at a power plant located in Apollo Beach, Florida. Now essentially, this power plant has these giant 12-story tall boilers which heat up coal, thus creating steam and generating power. However, this process generates quite a bit of ash. This ash will then fall to the bottom of that tank, where it is then heated up even more before flowing into a secondary tank. Now, once inside that secondary tank, water is used to cool down that waste, turning it into a solid state prior to being ground up and hauled off. Well, on this day in particular, a sizable chunk of solid slag which had been cooled down became lodged at the outtake door, in turn not allowing any more of this byproduct to escape, which is why the team had been called in. With that in mind, at around 4 p.m., they opened up the lower door and began blasting that chunk with water in order to unclog it. Little did they know just how horrible things were about to get. Seeing as plant management insisted on keeping the boiler online, more and more of this extremely hot slag continued draining into that secondary tank, meaning more and more pressure had began building up directly behind the clog. And roughly 20 minutes in, tons upon tons of what has essentially become lava began flying out of the end of that thing, not only landing directly on the workers, but it had also saturated everything around them and began pooling up around their feet. Before too long, they found themselves standing in a pool of this stuff roughly 6 inches deep as well as 40 feet wide. And here's where things get even more disturbing. As all of this is going on, one of those 6 men, Antonio Navarrete, whipped out his cell phone and left his mother one final voicemail. And while yes, this voicemail is short and simple, it just doesn't feel right stating exactly what it says in this video. But the gist of it is this. Antonio told his mother exactly what he was feeling at that time and asked her to call the police. By the end of the ordeal, unfortunately, only one of those men would survive. As for Tampa Electric, the company at fault, they ended up reaching individual settlements with all the victims' families. They were also charged about $140,000 in fines for their negligence on that day. So just what was the reason for leaving the system online that day? To avoid the cost and time of shutting it down. So that's it, y'all. That is going to do it for this portion of our video. As the final story, like I said, does fall into the same category, but there's a lot more to it than just a workplace accident or simple explanation for what had gone down. As for always, thank you for watching. Here's that final story. Back in April of 1991, police are conducting a welfare check at an apartment located in Seattle, Washington. And what they find is nothing short of a scene straight out of a horror movie. Upon entering, there's a few things that immediately strike them as being odd. Not only was there a thick layer of salt lining the doorway, it had also been lining every single room within. Moreover, there are multiple sources of audio going off at the same time, all of which are playing some sort of religious music. In addition to this, several spent candles in accordance with crucifixes had been placed on various surfaces within the apartment, as well as a multitude of books dealing with the occult. Well, further investigation would find a 35-year-old man deceased, seemingly having passed away while praying in his bathtub. This man's name was Christopher Case, and if you think that's weird, things are about to straight up take a turn into the abyss. Despite being completely healthy, the man's heart had suddenly and unexplainably just stopped beating. Before too long, a few of his friends began coming forward, all of whom would tell the exact same disturbing story. That is, just 1 week prior to his demise, Chris had cut a woman out of his life who had been making advances on him. Upon doing so, she informs Chris that she's a witch, that she'll be placing a curse on him, and surely he will be dead before the week's out. Now, I think this goes without saying that no one really thought anything of it at first. But within a few short days, those same friends receive a series of worrisome phone calls from Chris. And with each and every one of these instances, things became more and more unnerving. It all began with Chris having these auditory hallucinations of demonic voices that would keep him up all hours of the night, till eventually he is experiencing full-blown sleep paralysis, while also being scratched, cut, even being lifted and thrown back down onto his mattress. It was at this point he began purchasing various supplies from a religious bookstore, hence the crucifixes, candles, and books on defending himself from witchcraft. All of this leading up to the night of April 17th, 1991. Chris makes a few phone calls to various friends, and within just a couple of hours, he has gone full-blown Pope's exorcist inside that apartment. And it is theorized that at some point during the course of that night, someone or something terrified him so much his heart quite literally stopped on a dime. Not only was there no evidence of forced entry, there were no signs of struggle, and the official cause of death was listed as myocarditis.